Hello, ninth graders. Sorry for being sick or having someone sick at the house and missing class today, but we need to finish our fourth part of Unit 6 notes, which you can see is about fiscal policy. So remember what we've learned thus far. What we learned last week primarily was about what money is and what money functions as in an economy, both for businesses but also for individuals. Money is a medium of exchange. It's what we use when we need goods and services. We will use money as what we are going to give to a company. And remember, companies are going to use businesses, of course. What I mean by that is going to use money as a way of paying its customers, its people that it's purchasing resources from, things like that. Remember, money is a unit of account. We can use it to compare prices, and money is also a store of value, and is that store of value that is important for the financial system. We talked briefly about how the financial system works and what it does for affecting the entire economy, making credit available. So businesses and individuals can expand, grow, which is important for the economy. Then we talked about the Federal Reserve and its role for regulating the economy, making sure that the financial system stays safe and healthy, and then, of course, using monetary policy as a means of trying to grow the economy or to slow the effects of inflation. There's another entity which has the ability to affect the macroeconomy, and we see that through fiscal economy. So that other entity, as you can see in the picture here, is the U.S. government. So here's a great definition of fiscal policy. It says the use of government spending and tax policy to influence economic conditions. Okay, and what we mean by that is the ability to spend money, which is going to help grow the economy, or to lessen the spending of money, which also has a we might say slowing or a negative effect on the economy, which we want to use again to try and lessen the effects of inflation. So it says the term fiscal policy at the federal level refers to legislation passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. This changes the levels of taxation or government spending. Okay, so these are the primary means in which the government can affect the economy. That's through the spending of money. And by the spending of money, we don't just mean like Social Security or Medicare. We're primarily talking about projects that the government sponsors, the purchasing of weapons and other things like airplanes and aircraft carriers that the military can use, the purchasing of hiring contractors to build federal buildings, to build highways, tunnels, infrastructure for railroads that the government is sponsoring, railroad purchasing, anything like that. And remember, this is not just at the national level, but also local governments. State and local governments have the ability to affect the economies in their local areas through spending and taxing as well. And it says, by changing the amount of taxes people pay or by the amount of spending by the government, fiscal policy will influence economic activity. All right, so again, this is about influencing economic activity. If we can increase economic activity, this will have a positive effect on the economy. We'll see the economy grow. And so remember, how do we see the economy grow? We see an increase in real GDP over time. And remember, as real GDP grows, this is going to have a positive effect on lowering unemployment. So if we are in a recession, we might use an increase in the spending of money to help grow the economy. And the opposite is true. One of the downsides, remember, as we talked about last week, is when we have some type of expansionary policy, which is going to increase economic activity. This also increases prices across the economy, which is going to lead to inflation. So as a way of trying to lessen the effects of inflation, you can lessen economic activity by decreasing spending or, of course, by using tax policy as well. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So kind of this wide range what we're talking about with policy, right? Government policy, either through the Federal Reserve or through taxes and other legislation by the government, Congress specifically, can affect the economy. So monetary policy, right, that is under the purview of the Federal Reserve. Remember, we can increase or decrease interest rates, which has an effect on the money supply, right? And that is either through expansionary or contractionary policy. And we know that both of them are going to have an effect on GDP, effect on unemployment rate, and an effect on the inflation rate. On the fiscal side, it is policy by the federal government, particularly Congress, through legislation, through laws, right, which is specifically geared towards two things: the rate of taxation, either increasing or decreasing taxes on businesses and individuals, and the amount of money the government is spending on projects and other purchases, as we said, military purchases, the purchases of infrastructure, things like that, that have an effect. So when we talk about fiscal policy, there are two basic types. Just like we saw last week, there is a expansionary policy, which is designed to grow the government, and there is a contractionary policy, which is designed to decrease economic activity, which helps to lessen the effect of price changes, particularly inflation. So expansionary policy, as we said, is trying to increase economic activity. And we're going to use this when we are trying to move the economy out of a recession or to help lower unemployment. And I'm pausing just a little bit to allow you to write some of this down. So, Congress is the primary mover of this. Congress can increase government spending on projects, which again are things like we're purchasing a fleet of Navy ships, a shipment of a large amount of arms or bullets or things like that. Or we're building a military base. We're building government buildings, building a new highway, maintaining or resurfacing roads, building a bridge through a mountain or over a mountain or through a mountain to use a tunnel. Right? These are going to be the projects that we're talking about. And so when the government spends money on these projects, allocates money, those monies are going to go into businesses. Right? If businesses are being hired to build a railway, for example, they're going to need to purchase steel. They're going to need to purchase, all of the equipment that's going to build it. Right? They're going to have to hire workers. Right? And so that money is going to trickle out of the government and into the pockets of regular people. And people and businesses are going to spend that money, and it's going to increase economic activity. It's going to increase consumption, and it's going to increase investment spending by businesses, right? And that is going to have a positive effect on the economy. That's what happens when the government increases spending on these projects. Also, to have the same effect, Congress has the power to decrease taxes. And when Congress decreases taxes, the idea is that this will put money back into people's pockets. And when people have more money, they are going to spend it. Right? And so the spending will begin again to percolate across the economy, lead to increasing consumption, which is going to increase output of the economy or real GDP. Similarly, businesses, when they receive tax benefits, they also are going to spend, which we call investment spending, remember? And that is also going to have a positive effect of the economy. So these increased funds are going to increase economic activity. Remember, though, there is a trade-off for this, right? As the economic activity increases, this is going to have an effect on the price of goods and services because there is an increased demand for goods and services across the economy. this will lead to higher prices over time. And so this means that an increase in economic activity does have an inflationary effect. It is going to raise prices across the economy. So that's both a positive and a drawback. Now, if there is too much inflation in the economy, prices are too high, we can slow the rate of economic growth through the same type of policies. We're just going to reverse everything. So remember, when we reverse everything, we call this contractionary policy. All right, so notice our definition of contractionary policy. It is designed to stabilize prices or lower inflationary pressure. It's going to slowing the availability of money in the economy. All right, so how do we do this? Well, number one, government can spend less on these projects. As they spend less money will be going into contractors' hands. They're going to hire less workers. They're going to be buying less equipment. And therefore, we're going to see a slowdown or decrease over time in economic activity. Similarly, Congress has the power to increase taxes. Now, when individuals and businesses have to pay more in taxes, that's money that they cannot spend on other projects or consumption or investment. So this increase in taxes is also going to lessen economic activity, right? The lessening of economic activity will lead to lower prices eventually over the economy, or at least slowing the rate of price increase, right? Trying to stabilize these inflationary pressures, which is going to be help. Now, there is a trade-off, right? Reduced economic activity will lead to higher rates of unemployment and will slow the rate of growth of the economy. And if the government was to do this too much, right, it could actually push towards a recession. And remember, these kind of taxes are numerous, right? These could be tariffs. These could be income taxes. They could be corporate taxes, things like that. It's not just income taxes. So why is this increased tariff rate that we're seeing across the economy right now? Why is it causing such consternation in the market? Right, is going to decrease economic activity because even though a tariff is supposedly a tax on imported goods, the companies are not going to pay those taxes. It will be passed along to the consumer. So consumers will be spending higher prices on goods that are from overseas, but not just the finished products, but remember also resources that are coming from overseas. If there's just blanket tariffs, those are also going to be more expensive, which we're going to lead to inflationary pressures, which are actually going to counteract what we might want to see. So the problem with these tariffs is that it could not only reduce economic activity, which could lead to higher rates of unemployment, but also they are not going to have the stabilizing effect. We're not going to see a lessening of prices, especially in the short term, because all of those price increases are going to be passed on to the consumer. So you kind of have to be careful when you do this. Now, of course, these tariffs that are possibly going to be put on are actually not being done through congressional action or by law, right? It is kind of an emergency power that the president is claiming. So there's both political and economic ramifications to all of this. It's kind of interesting how the news, the current events kind of affects what we might see economically. So make sure that you kind of understand that and know that this is a real world thing. That is affecting right now. It's not just in the theory in the classroom we're talking about. This is actual policy which we're seeing play out in the real world right now. All right, so the way that the government, the Congress, can increase or decrease spending, remember, is through legislation. Now, we learned about how Congress budgets back in the first semester during government class, so hopefully this will just be a quick review. But remember that a budget includes all of the sources of income, all the money that the government brings in every year, as well as a list of their expenses, right? So income for government comes from two sources: taxes, as in income taxes, corporate taxes, but also fees on imported goods, that we call tariffs, duties, and other things like that. All right. Expenses include all the public goods and services that the government purchases, as well as what the government is paying on interest. So when the government budgets, and remember we looked at this back in the first semester, we saw that the government, spends trillions of dollars a year. Some of it's on what we call discretionary spending, which is spending on education, spending on healthcare, spending on defense budget, but also remember mandatory spending. There's all that money that's being spent in Medicare payouts, Medicaid payouts, and Social Security payouts, which is in the trillions of dollars. And then the government is having to pay interest on the debt that it owes. Right now, the government owes about $31 trillion, right? And so they're not only do they have to pay back that money over time, every year they're having to pay interest to those that own the government debt. And so that is a required payment. The government, by law, is required to pay that interest on the debt. And so, that's a huge outlay of money that is going out. That is money that the government is required to spend. Now, why is this a big deal, right? And so remember, we just talked about this. Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, right? They're paying the interest on the debt. All of those are required. Either is mandatory spending, right? So, that is huge amounts of money, trillions of dollars. The government is required obligations to pay. Remember that we have the discretionary spending, which is like defense and other public goods, education, healthcare, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So the government only has a limited amount of money that it can spend in these projects, which are going to have an effect on fiscal policy. Remember, anytime if I'm going too quickly, you can just pause the video and get the notes down, and then come back to it. So this is just a quick overlay of what the government is spending. So pensions, as you can see, that's Social Security, healthcare, education, defense, right? Large amounts of money, and then you can see the interest on the debt is a large chunk as well. All right, so this is important to understand that any effect of fiscal policy is going to have an effect on the national debt, and here's how. So the total amount of money that a government spends every year minus what it brings in taxation or revenue is going to lead to either a surplus or a deficit. And so remember, a surplus is going to exist when the total amount of income received exceeds or is higher than the expenses paid. So when the government brings in more money than it spends, this is called a surplus. Remember, this is not a very, and at least nationally, this does not happen very often. The government did run budget surpluses. Federal government did in the late 90s, but since September 11th, those have not been the case. And right now, our budget, we're running over $1 trillion in deficit every year, which is a huge amount. Which is why the national debt is added to so dramatically every year, and has been really since 2020. Because the opposite is true. When the government is spending more money than it brings in taxation, we call this a deficit. And so deficits, remember, when there is a deficit, the government has only one recourse to do, and that is that it must borrow money. And the more money the government borrows, the higher the debt is going to be. And remember, as the debt increases over time, that also means that the government every year is going to be required to pay a higher interest on the debt that is going to increase every year. And so what the government is spending is on things that it has no choice but to pay out every year is going to increase, which is going to further put pressure on trying to control spending in the economy. So the more the government runs deficits, the more it has to borrow. The more it has to borrow, the more interest it's going to have to pay, which is going to put greater pressure on the budget. So here's just an example from a couple years ago. The government spent $6.5 trillion. It brought in 4.9. That's a deficit of $1.6 trillion. Right? The government has to borrow money, has to sell government securities as a way of making up that shortfall. Right? It was $3 trillion deficit in 2020. Right, and the reason that it's less is because we had all of that kind of emergency spending during COVID, and it has to be made up some way. And so because we didn't have as much emergency spending in 2022, so that's why the deficit decreased. But understand that as that deficit is there, it is going to lead to more debt. All right, so the government running a deficit must borrow funds, as we said. Right. The government pays interest to those that own government debt. So who can own government debt? Well, lots of countries buy government debt because they are safe, secure ways of earning money. Right? You buy a government bond, and the government is going to not only pay you back for what you spent on the bond or lended the money to the government, you're also going to earn interest. And because the government is trusted, right? Foreign countries, Japan, China, India, Great Britain, they purchase government securities because it is secure. It's a place to put their money to increase the value of their money over time. But also people, investors, and common people like me and your family members can also purchase government bonds. Again, why? Because they're secure. You know that the government is going to pay them back. However, as the government has to borrow more money, as you can see on the chart, it is going to increase the government's debt, right? And as the debt runs higher, the amount of money that you have to pay in interest every year in the federal budget is going to increase. And as that increases, it makes it more likely the government's going to run a deficit, and it's going to kind of become a snowball, and it's just going to continue to grow, right? So any year that the government runs a deficit, it is going to increase the national debt. All right, so that is kind of how fiscal policy works, but also the economic effect that it can have on the economy. And remember, as the government increases debt, it is going to have a negative economic consequences because it's going to affect interest rates, it's going to affect spending by businesses and individuals. This all kind of becomes complicated, but it's important to understand that in the macroeconomy that all of these things are kind of interconnected. So the government does have power to affect economic activity through fiscal policy, but there are consequences or trade-offs for these fiscal policies, including, as you can see, the not only deficits year to year, but also an increasing accumulation of debt, which can have long-run or long-term economic consequences. So that is a very quick overview of fiscal policy. It is the final section of Unit 4. When we get back together, we're going to go over the answers to the worksheets that you finished Friday. We will have information to work on for Wednesday to complete kind of your studying for the test. And then you'll take the Unit 6 assessment on Thursday before Easter. So all that's going to happen over the next couple of days. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you back in class soon.